August 12, 1966. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. Staff Sergeant Mike Brennan of the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry, crouched in the elephant grass, sweat stinging his eyes as he scanned the tree line 200 meters ahead. His platoon had been humping through this goddamn province for 6 days, searching for a Viet Cong battalion that intelligence swore was operating in the area. They'd found nothing but empty villages and cold cooking fires. Quote 0, whispered his point man. Brennan raised his fist, halting the column. 40 men froze in place, M16 at the ready. This was it. The moment they'd been training for. Find the enemy, fix them in place, destroy them. That was what search and destroy meant. That's what General Westmoreland's doctrine demanded. But 300 meters to their east, hidden in a stand of bamboo, sat Captain Bob Milligan of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. He watched through binoculars as the American platoon prepared to advance on what was obviously bait. The movement was a single VC scout, deliberately exposing himself. Beyond the tree line, Milligan knew at least 24 guerrillas waited in prepared positions. He'd seen this dance a dozen times. The Americans would charge forward with overwhelming firepower. The VC would retreat after inflicting casualties. And tomorrow, the guerrillas would be back, stronger and wiser. The Americans were hunting the way they'd been taught, moving toward the enemy, seeking contact, trusting in superior firepower to win the day. What the Americans didn't know yet, what Milligan and his Australian SAS advisors were about to teach them, was that in the jungle, the hunter who moves forward is often the prey. The real predators moved backward. When Australian advisors first arrived in South Vietnam in 1962, they encountered an American military machine gearing up to fight the war the way it had always fought wars, with massive firepower, aggressive maneuvers, and the unshakable belief that American military doctrine, forged in the victories of World War II and tempered in Korea, would prevail. General William Westmoreland, commander of MACV, articulated this confidence in a 1965 briefing. Quote, his quote, strategy relied on helicopter mobility and artillery to find enemy forces and annihilate them. The math seemed simple. Kill more of them than they can replace, and eventually, they'll quit. American infantry doctrine emphasized movement to contact, aggressive patrolling designed to provoke enemy engagement. Units moved in column formations, with point elements designed to trigger ambushes so the main body could maneuver and overwhelm the enemy. It was a doctrine that had worked against the Wehrmacht in France and the Chinese in Korea. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Gunfighter Emerson summed it up perfectly. We're not going to wait for Charlie to come to us. We're going to find him. We're going to kill him. That's what infantrymen do. Close with and destroy the enemy. The problem, one that wouldn't become fully apparent until much later, was that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army weren't fighting to hold ground or win battles. They were fighting to survive long enough to make America quit. Initial American patrols in 1965 to 66 followed predictable patterns. Companies would helicopter into landing zones at dawn, sweep through grid squares, then extract before nightfall. We'd land, walk around all day in the heat, find nothing, and fly back, recalled specialist James Walsh. Then next week we'd do the same thing in a different grid square. Meanwhile, Charlie was watching us the whole time. The statistics told one story. American units were racking up impressive body counts, but the enemy kept coming. Villages that were pacified one week would be VC-controlled the next. Trails that were cleared would be booby-trapped again within days. Something fundamental wasn't working. But the Pentagon's metrics-driven approach focused on the numbers that looked good, not the strategic reality those numbers concealed. The Australian approach to jungle warfare hadn't been developed in PowerPoint presentations at the Pentagon. It had been forged through brutal experience in Malaya, Borneo, and the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Malayan emergency had been the crucible. British and Australian forces spent 12 years learning to fight communist insurgents on their own terms. Initial British tactics, aggressive sweeps, produced mediocre results. But over time, they developed something different. A patient, methodical approach that emphasized tracking, ambushing, and denying the enemy his sanctuaries. Captain Barry Peterson, an Australian officer, explained the difference. Quote 9. When the Australian Army training team arrived in 1962, they brought this philosophy with them. Colonel Ted Sarong immediately recognized that American tactics were poorly suited to the environment. The key innovation the Australians brought was, quote, 10. The art of following enemy tracks not to catch up with them, but to understand their patterns, predict their destinations, and set ambushes ahead of them. This required a fundamentally different mindset. Warrant Officer Kevin. Quote, 11. Wheatley described training South Vietnamese Rangers. Quote, 12. The technique required patience that American commanders, under pressure to produce body counts, often didn't have. But it produced results. Australian advised units were achieving kill ratios of 20-1 while taking minimal casualties. When the main Australian task force deployed in 1966, they brought this system with them. Instead of large sweeps, they sent out small teams on patrols that lasted up to 2 weeks. Major Harry Smith described the philosophy. The Americans wanted to find the enemy and destroy him immediately. We wanted to find the enemy and watch him until we could destroy his entire unit at a time and place of our choosing. It's the difference between shooting one rabbit and understanding where the whole warren is. The Australian SAS took this to the extreme. 5-man patrols would insert and spend 14 days in enemy territory, moving silently, avoiding contact unless they had an overwhelming advantage. They recognized that in a war without front lines, intelligence was more valuable than an immediate body count. Patience was a combat multiplier. January 8, 1967, near Sweedah Creek, Captain Jim Hughes of the U.S. 4th Battalion was frustrated. His company had run dozens of patrols, but the VC in his area seemed to multiply like mosquitoes. Kill 3, 5 more appear. That morning, he sat in on a briefing by Captain Bob Grandin of the Australian SAS. Grandin's patrol had spent 11 days tracking a VC logistics unit through the same area where Hughes had been operating. Grandin said, laying out photographs of tracks and subtle markers. Quote, 15. Hughes bristled. Quote, 16, he said. Quote, 17. Grandin replied. Quote, 18. The next day, Grandin took Hughes on patrol. For the first hour, they covered less than 300 meters. Every 10 minutes, Grandin stopped the patrol for silent observation. He pointed out disturbances invisible to the untrained eye. A snapped twig, discolored mud on a leaf, a stone turned wet side up. Grandin whispered. Over the next 3 hours, Grandin tracked the patrol to a concealed cache site. Instead of attacking, he called in coordinates and withdrew. 2 days later, an SAS team ambushed the site, killing 6 VC and capturing 3 tons of rice with 0 friendly casualties. Hughes was converted, he said. This realization, that the jungle war required predator skills, not warrior skills, began to spread. On April 23, 1967, Lieutenant Mike Berghoff's platoon was attached to an Australian operation. The Aussies gave him 3 days of intensive instruction in tracking and, quote, 23, quote, 24 hours, explained Warrant Officer Brian Wickens. Quote, 25. The changes seemed counterintuitive. Move slower. American patrols covered 6 clicks a day. Australian trained ones covered 1 or 2. Move quieter. Canteens were half filled to stop sloshing. Equipment was taped. Metal-on-metal noise was eliminated. Move, quote, 26, quote. Instead of pushing toward the enemy, move to a concealed position and wait. Quote 27. The Australians taught. Quote 28. On April 23rd, Berghoff's platoon set up a silent ambush along a suspected supply trail. They waited for 36 hours. No smoking, cold rations, barely moving. At 4:15 on the second night, a VC patrol of 11 men came down the trail. They were talking quietly, weapons slung, believing they were safe. Berghoff's platoon detonated claymores and opened fire. The engagement lasted 47 seconds. 11 VC killed. 0 American casualties. Quote, 29. Berghoff later wrote, quote, 30. By mid-1967, American units that converted were producing remarkable results. The 173rd Airborne Brigade reduced its casualty rates by 60% while increasing kills by 40% after training with Australians. Captain Paul Boucher described the transformation. Quote, 31. They employed tracking teams and, quote, 32. They made noise discipline a religion, Sergeant Robert Howard recalled. But the adoption was incomplete. Many commanders still demanded daily body counts, which the patient Australian method didn't always provide. The Viet Cong were not passive. As some American units became more dangerous, the enemy adapted. Captured documents warned, the new American units advised by Australian specialists are extremely dangerous. They do not patrol like regular Americans. They move like we do. Do not assume they will be noisy. VC units began sending scouts ahead to trigger ambushes. They moved off trails. They laid false trails. But they admitted the difficulty. Nguyen Van Thun, a former VC commander, recalled, "We could tell within 15 minutes if we were facing regular Americans or the ones trained by Australians. Against regular Americans, we could choose when to fight. Against the others, we had to be much more careful, or they would catch us sleeping." The Battle of Long Tan in August 1966 was the most dramatic demonstration. 108 Australians held off 2,500 VC and NVA troops. By conventional logic, they should have been wiped out. But their discipline, precision fire, and refusal to panic allowed them to inflict massive casualties and hold their ground. It proved that precision beat volume. By late 1967, American units using these tactics were seeing kill ratios of 18-1, triple their previous performance. Casualty rates from ambushes dropped by 70%. Mackie v. SOG teams operated deep in enemy rear areas with casualty rates below 5%. The statistics were compelling. 65% fewer casualties from ambush, 80% fewer from booby traps, triple the kill ratio. But here is where the story turns tragic. These successes were tactical, not strategic. Individual companies became efficient killers, but the war's fundamental dynamic, a conventional military trying to defeat an insurgency through attrition, remained unchanged. Tet 1968 revealed the truth. The offensive was a military catastrophe for the VC, and units trained in Australian tactics performed exceptionally well. But the political will of the American public was crumbling. General Abrams tried to spread Australian methods in late 1968, but by then, the question was no longer, quote, 36, quote, but, quote, 37, quote. Staff Sergeant Mike Brennan, the soldier frozen in the grass in the opening scene, survived his tour. He extended for a second one to teach the tactics he'd learned. "The Australians showed us we'd been doing it backwards," he said. "We were playing the enemy's game. The Aussies taught us to flip the script. The tactical lessons were clear, but the strategic lesson was darker. Superior tactics don't overcome flawed strategy. You can perfect the art of the jungle ambush while still losing the war." The Australian approach, patient, intelligence-driven, was incompatible with the U.S. military's culture of metrics and overwhelming firepower. The lessons influenced future conflicts. Army Rangers and Special Forces incorporated them into their doctrine for Iraq and Afghanistan. But the fundamental error persisted, the belief that tactical excellence can substitute for strategic coherence. In the end, Australian tactical genius didn't fail. It succeeded brilliantly at what tactics can accomplish. The failure was strategic. Captain Bob Milligan, the Australian who watched Brennan's platoon that day in 1966, wrote a letter in 1975. "We taught you to be better soldiers. You learned well. But we couldn't teach your country to want victory more than North Vietnam wanted it. That was the only lesson that mattered." The ambush Brennan walked into never happened. Milligan radioed the American commander, warned him off, and directed the platoon to an Australian-style ambush position. 2 days later, they caught the VC unit in the open. 17 enemy killed. 0 friendly casualties. Brennan lived because he learned to hunt backwards. But the war was lost anyway.